are all here to hear Paz Gutierrez. She is an assistant professor of design and building technology here at UC Berkeley's Department of Architecture. In 2008, she founded Group. It's an interdisciplinary research initiative that intersects both architecture and bioengineering. Her work has been exhibited and published nationally and internationally, and she has received numerous awards, too long to list now, but most recently in 2010, National Science Foundation Award for her research innovation in sustainable building technology. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Paz.
Thank you all for coming at this time. I know it's a time when we're all hungry and wanting to do many other things, so I appreciate the invitation. Thank you. At the center, it's my particular pleasure to be able to share my work with the context also of the Center for Latin America. Architectural research and practice relies more than anything on resources. Whether they're theory and production techniques, biophysical or socioeconomical conditions, human capital resources, are some of the multifaceted aspects that are entangled in the making of architecture. The unlimited global interdependencies and recurrent economical but also sustainable crises that we have to face today make the making of architecture, of sustainable practices, and specifically of sustainable innovation, a very, very complex challenge. This complex challenge is usually confronted and actually possible to reconstruct through the making or the shaping of inventiveness. And the ability to invent how or reposition how we think about. Can everybody hear me? Because I don't have a microphone. Yes? How we position ourselves with regards to the resources that we have, and try to think on how resourcing these resources is a fundamental part of how we can consider the possibility of advancing our connection to the world. And often operating interdependently and at multiple scales, balancing these flows involve climatic, social, cultural, historical, and economical resources of the built environment. So today I'm going to share with you how has this been constructed through my research, and specifically targeted also to developing countries, and particularly within the context of Latin America. So throughout history, we have related to both the inorganic and the organic world as physical and social cultural intertwined factors that required what I would call the exercise of design resilience. From the moment of, for example, what we see here, the salt ponds in the Incan culture, it was very carefully thought as an economic and physical connection, how that land had to be carved and allow for the containing of small salt ponds, because that made the process of obtaining salt more efficient. We have then, throughout history in multiple cultures, exercised what we would call the principle of economy of means and precision as a way in how much material is used in order to obtain a particular objective. But the exclusive narrow disciplinary specialization that we face today, particularly after the advent of the Industrial Revolution, questions how can we think about these multi-aspects in a way that's cohesive and at the same time specific. Also, the narrow disciplinary specialization is increasingly being implicated in the paradigms of our technological society that have brought itself, contemporary society, to environmental crisis. So the ecological imperatives of responsible resource management and clean energy would dictate the greater cohesion that develops between research disciplines. But this is actually not the case most of the times. So even though the way that a context functions is by interdependent conditions, something that I do, for instance, the building that I built, the type of wall that it will have a direct effect on that environment. We still think, mainly as architects, in designing things as separate conditions, as independent things, even though they're meant to behave interdependent. When I use the term architecture here, I'm referring to the making of the built environment in general, cities, buildings, landscapes, so in the broader sense. And how has this changed and become more extreme in the latter years? So we know that history reveals that human development has always been closely linked to the control and production of materials. So after a certain time, which again coincides with the advent of both the Industrial Revolution, but particularly with the use of synthetic materials that begin to be consolidated in the mid-19th century, we begin to see a shift in what? In the use mainly of renewable versus non-renewable resources. We begin to have higher and higher dependency on crude oil, our little friend here that we know so much about in our society. Well, this oil age that we then confront, if we look at the diagram here, how it was in the US 1900 vis-a-vis already in 2000, how that shifted completely. We begin then to have, merely from the point of view of the material, not to speak of all its socioeconomical, cultural implications, which would be a litany that I would have to list, but we're rather well acquainted with. How then the shift in the type of materials that we're using can and is impacting the world. And this is particularly important because the construction sector, unlike most people know, is the single responsible for is the highest single responsible for carbon emissions and energy expenditure in the world. It accounts for 50% of the energy and carbon emissions in the world. And it's highly not discussed as such a relevant factor, but it is. And so we carry an enormous responsibility in that sense in terms of social, cultural responsibilities. But there's something else about materials that matters much, and it's the fact that if we look at the material uses today, the polymers, the so-called polymers, which are back there, are beginning to be used increasingly more and more in architectural constructions, unlike before. And as we know, polymers, not biopolymers, but synthetic polymers, are mainly made out of crude oil and gas. So where do we stand as a world today with regards to both energy use, for instance, and water stress? Well, we stand with facing on the following condition, that if we were to use energy and water by the same parameters that we're using today, we would have an exponential increase, both of energy use but also of water stress, and I'll get to this more specifically within the context of Latin America. But this then raises the question of how do we position ourselves as designers with that reality? Whether we want to look at the future of the world from a utopic or dystopic view, how can we think about resources? How can we as architects, as we interact with the other disciplines, confront the complexity of, to name just a few, lesser land accessibility, but more people, more flood, higher energy consumption. So what are the strategies that we need to see in that context, and how does that differ when we consider developing countries vis-a-vis developing nations? And one of the most important aspects of that is that by US standard today, the US is the single highest user of energy in the world, as we know. However, developing countries, not per capita, but in total, use twice as much the amount of energy by the simple fact that we have much higher populations. It is predicted that by 2030, developing nations will use 5 times the number of energy that we use in developed world. So how can we think about new solutions that can address that simple fact? Because obviously the most simple aspect of non-renewable resources is that they're not renewable, so they can't be continued using at the same pattern forever. So what specifically should be addressed from the perspective of Latin America? The ICPP predicts that by 2030, almost 70% of the population in Latin America, will be affected by water stress alone. But the important part of Latin America is that not only does it contain the highest concentrations of population, not only contain one of the highest concentrations of population in urban areas that lack proper resource management, but it also withholds one of the most significant natural resources. For example, the natural wealth of Latin America and the Caribbean allows the region to have one of the most extreme cases in the sense of one of the best opportunities of biodiversity. If we look at its range in comparison to any other place in the world, even the only comparison would be from Australia to mid-Asia, of extension of land with high concentration of biodiversity. We see here, for example, the Mata Atlântica in Brazil, or the area in Peru, Ecuador, the Amazon, central parts of Central America, Guatemala, Mexico, etc. You have an extreme, wonderful wealth of biodiversity. Very, very unique. So that goes paired with the strong conditions of extreme water stress. And if we look at the projections, it will only increase further and further. If we look at that with regards to the use, the projection of energy use, we're going to have that, for instance, in emerging global economies alone, the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, for instance, that is located in Latin America, would be using a pattern of energy that's unsustainable. Needless to say, the concentration that we have, I'm just showing here in South America, but we know that it's the case also in parts of Central America, of metropolis and cities of strong urban densities and population. So how can we then think about this simple equation that we know that by laws of thermodynamics, you have to have an equilibrium between energy material output and material input. And if the way that we construct today is all based as a linear metabolism, in which all that we turn out back is pollution, heat, etc., how can we shift that and think about what we call in natural environments autotroph communities, right? So closed loop cycles in which we can process these resources to obtain things. Before I talk specifically about my research, I want to give you a little bit of background on how did I arrive to this. So through my childhood and all my years, except for the past 10 years in which I have been working and studying before that, here in the US, I spent back and forth multiple times between Chile, Brazil. That's why I always call myself a South American more than just a Chilean. But coming back and seeing what urban contexts are in comparison to other places where I lived, such as Amsterdam or Philadelphia, through my youth. And this led me to question myself very much from early on, what role does space play in the making or the shaping of cultural identities? But beyond that is the fact that growing up where I spent most of my early years, which was in this city, which is, any of you that have been there, it does look like a postcard, it's not fake. Growing up in urban realities such as Rio makes it almost impossible not to become alert to the role of the living world, but at the same time of marginalized space. From its exuberant vegetation, topography, smells, music, to the everyday spontaneous struggle faced to access minimum resources in a field of abundance is inevitable. And I do not think, by the way, I could do what I do today had I not been exposed to that very early on. But at the same time that I was exposed to this reality, my other part of Latin America was the climatic and geographical contrasts of my birthland of Chile. That boasts one of the driest deserts in the world, the Atacama Desert, the glacial conformations, and even, I would say, the nature of the Chilean people is a much more reserved and much more about contrasts and these struggles than the exuberance, for example, that you would find in the Brazilian culture. And so this interplay was always in the back of my mind. So when I was working in Chile as an architect, that's where I did all my undergraduate studies, and got my license there in 1998. All my first connection to architecture actually was on how to position yourself through the invention of perhaps small shifts, but taking the risk of new things that could deal with a better management of both climate, energy, and resources. I was very fortunate to work already in the year 99 with the development of the second building in the world that was using hydroponics as a way to work with thermal management. So we were dealing with that with plants as a way to create shading and so forth because we wanted to use less energy. We were working with studying the material quality to enable light diffusion and human comfort in the context. And this is what all the projects that I was working with before coming to the US. So when I came to the US and I graduated, I did my graduate studies and I graduated, I was hired by a large, well-respected firm in its work. And my connection to architecture was not at all about the same type of values. It was not about trying to work with that quick, shifted inventiveness, but it was actually how you would take innovation as the careful choosing of what was labeled as innovative products and incorporating that into a very corporate, commercial-based context. After 2 years and a half, despite the fact that the design I did won that award that you see there, it led me to a crisis because they were so different realities that I resigned. I said, I want to go back to this idea that even though it's a large project, it can be based on the risk of that small invention. And without actually being understanding of the reality of why does that happen in the US so different than in the case of Latin America. It's because, first of all, in Latin America, code in general tends to be less restrictive. So you're more able to exercise these types of innovations. Also, you tend to have smaller budgets. So if you can cut costs here and there, it's usually incentivated more. Here we detail much more buildings. It's much less about improvising on site. Why? The cost of labor here is much more expensive. Over there, unfortunately, from other perspectives, is much cheaper. And so there's obviously, as always, two sides to this situation. But when I resigned at ECCB, and I said, I can't continue to do this because for me, I really want to be able to enter into and go back to my roots of working with material craftsmanship and really thinking about issues of environment and closer proximity to communities. They decided to hire me as a material research consultant. And while I was doing that, I said, I'm going to go back to my roots and see what can I do as a person that has my background within the context of the US. And for 4 years then I worked with an interdisciplinary practice with Donald Gensel, who's a public artist. And we began to do experimentations. I don't have time today to get into this, but through community-built work of material innovation. So it was all very intertwined to the community being involved in how we could then somehow take the advances that are happening in technology, which are usually for higher end constructions, and reshift them into community-built work. And this is how I eventually landed in Berkeley. They were interested in that and what I was doing as contributing to develop an MS and PhD program on built ecologies. That was the name of it in New York City. But this work with the community and trying to pursue material innovation led me more and more, as I'll explain in a moment, to the realization that there would only be so much that I could do as an architect. Because ultimately the complexity of really trying to establish a leap in sustainable practices goes way beyond architecture. And so with this aim, I established in 2008 the possibility of new interdisciplinary collaborations with bioengineering. I came one day, whether it's an epiphany or not, only time will tell, but to the realization that why not think about architecture that could be controlled instead of these large, complicated things that we call intelligent buildings, which are usually very dumb buildings. And think about what science is doing today and what shifts are in very small scale. Could we think about that? And could we think about materials in a different way? And this is how BIOMS then emerges as this possibility of looking at how that micro scale can be then a way to control large scale conditions. The work then that I'm going to share today is very much based on that, on how the material itself can inform the way, again, in which how we position ourselves for the resource and rethink how, instead of mitigating ecological challenges, or what we normally call mitigating pressures, that we work with them in synergy so we can capitalize on the flows that exist in ecologies instead of trying to, I believe, restrain that which is not restrainable, because we're not gods, let's say, or God, or not nature. I can't directly control that sea, for example, from rising, because by now the damage we've done is so far that we can only try to do better practices with it. So how can we think about architecture in a way that can somehow reposition itself to work with that? And that's how BIOMS will be created. So the first thing about it is that the way that we then have to consider this is that to work as architects within this context, the traditional disciplines that would normally feed this relationship between contractor, client, and architect are going to be very different. So the work through BIOMS then begins to enter into incorporating sciences and humanities. It has mainly been through science now, but humanities are very important as well, into complete new different disciplines that would be very extraneous to the traditional making of architecture, bioengineering, material science, and so forth. And this will plays a big role because unlike interdisciplinary collaborations in which, for example, we're solving things as architects, and after we have done our initial design, we call somebody in to discuss a problem. The difference with the work that we're developing is that the bioengineer, the material scientist, the civil engineer, we sit at the inception of the design process to then reconsider how things can be thought. And so that's the first particularity that the work we do has. The second of it is how can we develop self-regulation or adaptability through the material itself. So instead of working with additional sources of energy or complex mechanical constructs, is how can we think about the material itself as a means to regulate and adapt to the environment. And then the third fundamental aspect is that the problem, the design problem, is framed at multiple scales at the same time and evaluated at multiple scales at the same time, from the geological scale to the nano scale. And so this will build our projects that if the purpose is how to control light, how can we then position ourselves through resources? So I'm not going to be showing this project today, but as an example, I always choose the worst case scenario. So for instance, extreme water stress in an area as, for example, northern Chile, or the Altiplano in general, and how does that goes paired with an area that you have a strong abundance of sunlight. So how can we think about these extreme conditions that are both social and physical, social, cultural, and physical, and think about then, in this case, for instance, how through very micro-scale lenses, which is a bioengineered condition, we could disinfect gray water. Solar disinfection has been used for a long time now, but by disinfecting this water, could we use then the heat that the water accumulates, and working in an area such as the Altiplano, in which you have a delta temperature that's extreme, right? So you have usually very, very cold nights, and bring back this hot water through this lab into radiant floor heating. So you disinfect the water, you deal with the issue of the water scarcity through recycling that water, but at the same time, you also couple that with energy used by the heat release. And that's how the projects, the three projects that I'm going to show, are going to be structured. The first project that I'd like to show deals with this question here of what is the future of emergency deployable housing in flood-prone regions? And are the current solutions that we have suitable for hot, humid climates where inundations and economical restrictions are mostly constant? You see here, for example, the recent inundation in Alagoas in northern Brazil on this past April. And as we well know, usually those that tend to be most affected by extreme natural resource conditions are what? Areas that are usually with very bad infrastructure, bad resource management, and constructions that don't have much quality. So how are we prepared in the world in terms of, one, what the structures are themselves, and two, I won't get to talk about that today, but how they're deployed. Hate not to go too far, right? A situation such as that. Did we use the proper architecture? Or not to go too far. Katrina alone, right? So flooding, we have so many of these cases. And the reason for it is why? If we look at a map of the developing world, look at how many areas of extreme flood hazards we have here in South America and in Central America. And look at how many areas do we have flood risk. That's extreme. That's a hotspot. So it's also high vulnerability. Obviously, it's not just in Latin America. We have many other places in the world, but today I'd like to concentrate myself on that. And if we look at the recurrences of floods in Latin America in the past years and how spread around they are within our context and how these fall within highly populated areas of these regions, it's a very, very crucial thing to study. This project that we're working on began by questioning could we have the advantages of a tent in the sense that for a tropical region it's breathable, it allows the air to pass through, so it makes much sense, but it doesn't from the perspective of compatibility with water. Why? It leaks, evidently, because it's permeable. Pneumatic structures, which are fantastic for the Antarctica because they create air insulation and light diffusion, would be potentially very good. So this first project looks at the fact of could we think about a hybrid? And so this project is currently under also collaboration, not just with my main collaborator, the director here at Biomimetics Center at Berkeley, but also with the Materials Research Institute in Switzerland. And again, we begin first by looking at the relationship of materials from the very, very small scale to all the implications that it has both physically but also socially with regards to its use. Another very important part of what I do is the so-called biomimetics, or what I rather call biologically inspired technologies. Can we look back at nature and see models of efficiency in nature to then incorporate that into architecture? But I would like to be very explicit, even though most of you are not an architecture audience, that this is not as it's normally discussed in architecture today, which is more about copying of a form or an analogy of a form, but the interest in biological inspiration is really by looking at how that organism functions in nature and trying to study that. So when I was interested in this idea of the skin or some sort of regulation that could deal with the hot, humid climate in which we could consider the possibility of a skin that not only would breathe but would allow for spaces to be dehumidified, I, after studying a good bit, realized that actually insects have the best system to detect in nature what we call hygrothermal, so humidity and temperature-based conditions to adapt. And so this is what we would call, just to explain very briefly so I don't bore you all to death with this, but what we call a psychometric chart. Any of you that have studied issues of climate would know what this is, but basically what it is a means to measure the temperature relationship with a gram of water content. So when we talk here, which is the relative humidity, right? It measures where are the comfort zones within different climates. So for example, what happens that because the air velocity changes our perception, right, of heat because of the evapotranspiration, what happens that if we augment the air velocity in a place that is hot and humid, our comfort zone expands. And if we do that and we also dehumidify, we can expand that furthermore. So this project, I'm going to skip these things because for this presentation are not important, but we look at very specific data and how if we used a dehumidification membrane, we could obtain different degrees of variation of comfort zone as required. So the project began by looking at both what would be an optimized shape, both with regards to the possibility of working well with changes in flood, but also with controlling the amount of air intake at the large scale. This is what we would call in architecture parametric analysis of a prototype. And then how could we obtain the idea of a buoyant system, but that at the same time the skin itself then would regulate the system. And this is then how, I'm not going to get into much detail, but fundamentally what we have done is we have used from and developed from bioengineering a microlens, which is actually it's based on insects' eyes, as a way to detect the amount of light. And that goes paired with a specific material which is light reactive, so a photoreactive natural polymer, that together with a material here that expands depending on the condition of humidity. So these two very different types of information are paired to allow for the skin to create pores that open or enclose. So we control how much air intake you have into the space. Again, I'm not going to, because here it doesn't matter, but get into too much of the technological aspects of this. But what matters is that then we can understand how by the material reaction, because of light and because of humidity, how we differentiate pressure. So we have pressure differentiation that then can augment or slow the air intake. And then this is associated with an internal membrane that's a desiccant. So what do we obtain? We can obtain housing that can be used, very easily construct lightweight, thin membrane. This is what we're establishing research, which just received NSF funding for this project. And hopefully in 3 years from now we'll have good tests on this prototype. But we can then obtain this breathable membrane that then would allow that in contexts such as this, these could be shipped very quickly, mounted very quickly, and people can stay there for a while without having to use, for example, air conditioning and so forth, which they normally wouldn't have access anyway. But if they want to use it for a longer time, they would still have durability and be able to have a comfortable climate for this type of contexts. The second project, and I don't have much time, so I may go just very quickly on this because I do want to show the last project, deals actually with the possibility of, can we think about material systems that would integrate agricultural surplus in a way that could work, again, as a means to reconduct energy or resources. I'm not going to get again into the use of plastics that I referred to earlier. We have a high production of plastics today, and 50% of that enormous amount is going into municipal waste. So the project begins to look at, could I have a wall system that would use both plastic waste, but also that agricultural surplus or remainder that's not being used, or if used is just for mere economical speculation, which does usually not much good, as we all know. And think about a way that we could decrease energy use. And so this project, again, I'm also working here with material scientists from an institute, uses then a polymer, which is PMMA, polymethylmethacrylate, which has a refractive index or an ability to refract light, which is very similar to a glass. It can be completely transparent. It's usually known as an acrylic, right? And so we began to look, can't see anything here. Well, all the parameters, embodied energy, et cetera, resistance, refractive index, all these is done. It's very complex to explain now, but multiple parameters in which we visualize information all at once. And I began to be very interested in what role does sugar play? Because I was studying at the same time corn and sugar corn. We know all of its implications just in our domestic conditions, and I'll get back to this in a moment. But of these agricultural products that are largely subsidized by large economies. And I was particularly interested in sugar and the role that it was playing in the context of Brazil, because as we know, Brazil is using ethanol, which is very criticized in many ways. So it's good in the sense that it decreases dependency in oil, foreign oil and all that, but it has its consequences also to land, particularly with regards to use of water. So with sugar, I began to look both at sugar cane and beet cane, and it's a product that I was able to discover that it has an equivalent transparency to glass and an equivalent refraction, believe it or not, because of its crystalline conformation. And it is obviously as an agricultural product, it has biodegradability and the potential of low energy production. So I began to map the differences that exist in the production of beet sugar and cane sugar. And even though sugar cane has 4 times higher the use of water than beet cane, it does produce an ethanol that is 30 times higher than corn. And recently, new advances have been able to obtain, actually, from the production of ethanol, water, which is something that's unknown. And so I became particularly interested in looking at the possibilities of sugarcane and what are its impacts in terms of balance in the world. But specifically, at what's the fundamental difference of carbon dioxide produced by the production of biomass, or for example, sugar cane vis-a-vis ethanol from corn. So ethanol from sugar versus ethanol from corn. And it's a dramatic difference. So from the perspective of carbon emission, the production, for example, of ethanol from sugar cane is much more advantageous. And this project then uses the remainder of sugar, the part of sugar that's not refined, that's the byproduct in the production, and uses then these crystals and works with optic principles, which I'm not going to get into at different scales. And we studied specifically the condition of Fresnel lenses and the ways of reconducting light, and what role does form and play both, and density play with regards to thermal radiation, but also structure. So here we see the variation of the sugar density. And then we were able to obtain a wall system that one side is absolutely opaque, and on the other side it allows for variable light induction, and that has a much lower embodied energy compared to a equivalent plane of glass panel, but with an equivalence of refractive index and a control of the thermal conductivity because it's variable. That's our first prototype. The last project, because I've already taken up a lot of time, is that the time?
It's 1:52 or 12:52.
12:52, okay, I said okay. I said I can't have spoken for 2 hours. The last project looks into the possibility of using salt water as an asset for energy efficiency. So again, how can we think about our architectural solutions that can work with shoreline inundation? We evidently want to control as much possible shoreline inundation, but how can we control that shoreline inundation if we can't be every time retreating back and back and back? And shoreline inundation will have to do both with two fundamental aspects. One of them is obviously is a sea level rise. But another very important aspect is the depletion of what that border is in terms of land. And those are fundamentally two in the world, either mangroves, which are going to be located in tropical areas, or salt marshes, as we have here in temperate climates. And so this project looks specifically at what is the condition then of salt endangered regions in the world of salt marshes and water stress. And so by mapping these, we began actually studying first San Francisco Bay, which I'm not going to show today, but I discovered that the central region in Chile, the coastal central region in Chile, is one of the most affected areas by urban development pressure. And with that also, it happens to be that we know both Peru and Chile are highly dependent on fish production. So they hold specifically 20% of the world's production of fish, and particularly Chile, not just salmon, but actually a large part of it has to do with what's found in the outer, more in the inner sea, what's called the pelagic coast. And so this became particularly important because much of the livelihood also of the country, of the populations of the country that are in coastal regions, which are highly affected by, again, extreme flood conditions, and this is where we have most of our population concentrated. This is the part that was highly affected by the recent tsunami areas that we were just discussing. And has very specific conditions in terms of upcurrents that make the area in the years to come one of the most endangered both areas of salt marshes because of the bad development, but also of flood risk conditions. And so we began to look at, would there be a way in which we could have a high urban density development, but that could use perhaps even to its benefit some parts of inundation. Again, always a project, here is neither context nor the time, but we look at what are those conditions at the large scale, at the smaller scale, and so forth, up to the very small material scale. And this is a project that's at very early stage of development that I'm working with the Physics and Mechanical Engineering Department of Universidad Federico Santa Maria in Valparaíso. But looking at, would there be ways, or should there even be ways, in which we could retain the water and divert the flow of water into specific salt ponds, and think about having high density development that would guarantee at the same time a certain proportion of salt marshes and specific areas where the salt water, if we have inundations, would be diverted to. And if so, then what could we do with retaining that water? Well, it happens to be that, as most of you may know probably, non-convection solar ponds or variable convection solar ponds allow for what? The production by the differentiation in temperatures that we have here for having an upper crust layer of potentially desalinized water. The problem with these type of conditions is that what works as a remainder, which is this middle layer, which is a large proportion of this water, is actually used, or when it's used for potential cogeneration of energy, that there's a lot of contaminants with it. But there's been recent development in discovering that if actually this layer is used for an aquaculture with certain type actually of shrimp, it can degrade the contaminants that then are produced by taking what is called a salt bittern, which is that high concentration of salt there, into the production then of energy. And so this bottom layer here can be used of salt to produce energy. As you see here, right, so 7,000 square meters allow for 150 kilowatts generation. So basically, with a 14 by 14 feet meter pond of approximately 5 meters depth, you can have sufficient energy to run a residential tower of 8 to 9 floors. And so if we, oops, what did I do there? There we go. If we then do so, we could think about the incorporation then of land that would be with salt marshes and the urban development, but where the water, that inundation, could be used for a purpose. And this is what I mean by positioning ourselves in how to resource that resource that you cannot control. And so we're studying now what would be the morphology. It's all very much based on hydrodynamics, the morphology of these ponds. Could we think about a material system that would react differently to the salinity, so we can control very naturally how this can be reconducted and when and how? And testing that, specifically what would be that degree. I would just like to end by saying that I believe that as human intelligibility of nature progresses, so will our capacity to approximate better the design of these innovative or intelligent built environments. Through biosynthetic, multifunctional composites that provide advantages beyond the sum of individual capabilities, environmental flows will be discriminately reconducted, transformed, material waste will be degraded, etc. And so these advances will impact significantly, I believe, in the future, structural biomechanical systems, reducing size, weight, cost, transportability, and therefore significantly helping in reducing non-renewable resource dependency. So with that, we have to remember that sustainable innovation seeks to advance ultimately our ability to better resource resources, addressing the often overlooked social-cultural responsibilities of architecture. And I just wanted to end with that fragment. If any of you do speak Spanish or do know a bit of Chilean context, we know Violeta Parra was one of our, perhaps our best author that we ever had in music. And she writes about the relationship between this stone and the, I wouldn't say that's live and that's not, but let's say the mineral and the organic world, that moss and the stone, and how one intertwines and coexists with the other in her famous Volver a los 17 song. And I think that's exactly how we can rethink about architecture, not resist mold, not resist algae, but actually work with it, but with a purpose. And work with it in terms of biophysical conditions, but never forgetting the social cultural conditions that are so often overlooked when we tend to work with very high-end, next-generation sustainable architecture practices. Because the moment we lose the other side of the equation, it loses its real opportunity of applicability.
We have time for a few brief questions, so I'll let you call on anyone if someone has questions.
Please.
Yeah, a simple question. How far is this approach impacting on the practice of architects and on public policy? Where are you being listened to?
Well, that's a very good question. It's interesting because I think that for a while I've been sort of in my, if you will, lab. I mean, I have kept a connection to Latin America in the sense that I'm always going there. I go to lecture. I was there this past November, working there with people at the Universidad Santa Maria, and also went to lecture at the Universidad Católica in Santiago. But beyond that, I'm finally being able to go back to their roots, and it's interesting how things happen. And we'll be actually next year initiating a prototype that will be built. Going back to this idea that we're able to pursue things that actually get built quicker because of the fact that I guess we're maybe willing to risk a bit more. I am going next year to develop a housing prototype in Valdivia. I'm working there with both the mayor and the Ministry of Housing and cellulose company that has created a lot. Some of you may have heard of this Celco in that region. It happens to be that a large part of the area around Valdivia was completely devastated, although especially Fisherman's Village after the tsunami this past April. And so now the Ministry of Housing has turned to a particular attention, has just signed a bilateral agreement with the U.S. in terms of following LEED certification, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's by the U.S. Green Building Council. And so they're very interested through this funding, but funding more actually towards sustainable housing. And so I'm beginning to work on a prototype with a local group of architects that would be for flood-prone regions, which would be very low cost, and that would work with dehumidification, but in this case for colder climates. So we're trying to pair the possibility of recycling water because the water there is highly contaminated. So even though there's abundance of water, it's bad water. So recycling still plays an advantage. And how can we concentrate the not so abundant sunlight that we have there to clean that water and at the same time work with a membrane that can allow for dehumidification but heat concentration. So it's similar but very opposite than what I showed here for the other type of structures. Yes.
I really enjoyed your presentation, although I found it a little bit too short. Would have liked it to be longer. But it seems to me that something that seems to be missing is the community. You started talking about the community, and I don't see the community involved in any one of these projects. Like the first project, I find it very creative, but I'm not sure you could just go to a community, install these insect-looking objects and assume that they're going to use them just because they're more efficient. I remember I have a friend who works in Barcelona, and she worked with a group of gypsies, and the city built for these communities homes and gave it to them. Then these people moved in. The first thing they did was tear out all the windows, tear out all the doors, tear out all the copper piping to sell it, and then they felt more or less comfortable living there. So the city spent, I don't know how much money doing things that the people actually did not want. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not going to want this, but how do you negotiate?
Yes, you're absolutely right. These three last projects that I showed have not involved community. And the reason why I call them prototypes are because they're trying to address somehow certain universal issues. But I also think that in a prototype, it's fundamental that a part of it is left open to adapt to very specific local conditions. Having done work with local communities, mainly in Philadelphia in my case, in New York for the 4 years as I was explaining very briefly, I am absolutely aware and I'm not going to justify something that has not been addressed. I think that a large part of this is that the difference with the standard way in which architecture is made is when things are usually in a very short period of time. is that this is mainly fundamental research that's being funded by organisms such as National Science Foundation. And they're very interested not in specific projects, but in establishing research to open new niches. And that's the main focus that these projects are doing as of now. That's why next year I'm going to spend 2 months in Chile, working not just with government organizations and companies, but also NGOs and those type of things, and local communities, to see what are the specific localized conditions that this project should have and must have. So they're all, again, that's why I ended by saying, if we just concentrate on the issues of the building performance and so forth, and we overlook the socio-cultural aspects, it's never going to work, or certainly it's never going to work well. So thank you. I think that that's very, very important. The lady there, and then we can...
My question was actually about
okay.
community engagement.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And mine is pretty much in the same line, but also, oh, thank you, this was super interesting, especially the second project about how to use waste in sugarcane. I am from Panama, and one very interesting thing is that since you're here, I don't know if you're aware of, but there's I work with a nonprofit organization, a volunteer, they're called Global Brigades, and in UC Berkeley, there's a student group, it's called Global Architecture Brigades. And what they do is that they go to Panama and Honduras for 1 week. Last year, we were the architecture brigades program. We have 9 programs, but the architecture program was working in Panama. And this year, they are starting in Honduras, and they go for 1 week and they volunteer in projects, community projects. So if you have ever, I think it will be really cool because you are in UC Berkeley. So being that connection with the students, I would love to put you in contact with the students because they're students from the States, like from UC Berkeley, from here, like going to Panama or to Honduras and using all these ideas and all implementing. They first, how it works is that they do a design competition and they go and they build. They're on the ground. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous.
It's very good.
But what I wanted, especially because the second thing, when you work in communities that are underdeveloped communities like in Panama or in Honduras, you talk about the economic factor, indigenous communities or campesinos, they're people that cannot afford. So it will be very interesting if you can put into practice this second project we were talking about, how to use sugarcane, how to put it into practice and allow students from UC Berkeley to actually be a part of this project.
It's really, actually, I didn't show this, but it's interesting that you mentioned that about sugar because the project, again, it's something that would take a long time to show, but the project, one of the community built projects that I did in Philadelphia, and I'd be happy to talk to you individually about it later on, but I literally, I got into a fight with Philadelphia School District because I was trying to develop a new system for floor cover that would be transparent and use the sugar that would decrease the amount of synthetic polymer use and at the same time be transparent. And after a year and a half of real fight with them because there's no way, this hasn't been tested sufficiently and I stood and eventually, because it was a community build project and I had the community backing me up so much, it got built. And it's there, and it's the only project that I think I know in the world that has been done with that specific type of technology. But it was beautiful to see the power of the community in that sense, because I, as an architect, at the time would have never been able to get that within the context here had I not really worked with the community together into doing this.
Especially in Panama, we have a partner that works with helping create sustainable farms. So they have 320 farms that they support. So imagine most of these farms are doing sugarcane. So I'm thinking this will be an amazing opportunity.
I love it. Sounds great. Thank you.
Is there a question? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
very much.